Okay, hello, welcome. Just wanted to remind you all that the audience is not audible or visible, but you may ask questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. And just want to remind again that the session is being recorded and will be available at the Hastings Center website later in the day with closed captioning. This is the Hastings Center's second event in the Artificial Intelligence and Society series. The next event is on October 19th, and it will explore the hype around the technology. I'd like to take a second to introduce one of our moderators. Josephine Johnston is a senior research scholar at the Hastings Center and lecturer in medical law and bioethics at the University of Otago, New Zealand.
Thank you, Brianna, Tina koutou katoa, haere mai, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Hastings Centre for this conversation about some of the benefits and challenges of AI in healthcare. So I'm sure, like many of you, I've been trying to follow the emergence of machine learning and the development of artificial intelligence, or AI. And I understand a little bit, that algorithms have been developed to crunch big collections of data, sifting useful information from mountains of data points, searching for patterns and anomalies. I know that we've been developing the tools to make more and more accurate predictions based on all that data. And of course, I've heard of generative AI, specifically ChatGPT. We all have, although I have to admit I haven't used it in my own work, but I've no doubt encountered it in the essays written by my students. But even as we are all trying to keep abreast of the news, I know that I feel quite unprepared for the personal choices I might need to make about using AI in my own life, whether that's in banking or education or healthcare or some other sector. And as a bioethics researcher and teacher, I'm acutely aware that I should know more about AI in the healthcare sector in particular. How is it being used now, and how will it likely be used in the future? Because concerns have been raised about bias in machine learning, and because we all know that technologies don't usually benefit everyone equally all at once, I have questions, and maybe you do too, about what we as a community of thinkers, researchers, educators, and engaged citizens should be considering and doing and calling for when it comes to the use of AI in the health and healthcare space. So today we're going to dig into these issues a little. Where is AI at today in healthcare? Where is it headed? What specific benefits might it deliver? And what specific challenges does it pose? Can AI improve healthcare for everyone? We're going to have that conversation first with two experts in the ethical and policy challenges raised by AI in healthcare, and then we're going to open up that conversation to you. So in the first part of the conversation, if questions occur to you that you'd like put to our panelists, please simply type your question into the Q&A function here on Zoom. We will collate these questions and address them in the second part of today's discussion. So I'm going to introduce our panelists now today. They are Nicol Turner-Lee of the Brookings Institution and Danielle Witcher of Mathematica. Dr. Turner-Lee is a Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at Brookings, where she is also Director of the Centre for Technology Innovation and Co-Editor-in-Chief of the Tech Tank podcast. Her research focuses on how public policy can enable equitable access to technology and harness technology's power to create change in communities in the US and across the world. Nicol is an expert on the intersection of race, wealth, and technology, and the author of a forthcoming book on the digital divide. Dr. Witcher is a health services researcher with expertise in learning health systems, health information technology, health system delivery, and financing reform and bioethics. Mathematica, where Dr. Witcher works, is a research and consulting company. Before coming to Mathematica, Danielle worked on the National Academy of Medicine, including on their 2019 report, AI in Healthcare, the Hope, the Hype, the Promise, the Peril. Welcome, Nicol and Danielle.
Thanks for having us.
So let's maybe just go back a little bit and talk about how we got where we are today. And let's begin with you, Nicol. How did machine learning and AI develop in healthcare settings, and what opportunities or promises does it offer in that particular context?
Well, the question of how did this all happen, I don't think we all know, right? One day we actually had these machines making positioning recommendations, using market surveillance to target us in advertisements. And now we're seeing these technologies really move into these sectors, right? Sectors that not only have benefited in some way or form from the use of technology. In particular, the healthcare industry has a long history when it comes to electronic health records, et cetera. But it's being used in ways that actually makes predictable, quote unquote, decisions around particular subjects. And in many respects, just to sort of tag on how we got here, all of us that are actually involved with some level of AI, and most likely we are, have become the subjects of this technology, which makes it even more interesting in the area of healthcare. Healthcare, where we supposedly have some agency or should have some agency over those outcomes. And so I think this conversation that we're having today really is an important conversation because there are some benefits to these automated systems, right? First and foremost, we're able to use artificial intelligence, particularly machine learning algorithms that offer this repetitiveness of decision-making, to be able to do things like understanding a compilation of health records and health notes and being able to collaborate across physicians. I was in the doctor not too long ago, and the nurse assistant actually used AI to ensure that there was no pharmaceutical interaction with my existing penicillin allergies. Things like that we could not do without the introduction of these technologies. And then I would say one more thing. A dear friend of mine, Dr. Faye Cobb-Payton, wrote this really interesting paper on metadata, real small data when it comes to AI, and how important that's actually going to be when it comes to addressing health disparities. Right now, a lot of the AI, and I will talk about some of the challenges in just a moment, are scraping real big data sets, right, of information that's collected from patients. But there is some interest in using AI to actually delve into health disparities. Where are there chronic conditions, hereditary conditions that we can use some of the more expert areas like radiology and other places where we're seeing AI work quite effectively to ensure that we reduce the type of wide disparities that exist across demographic groups. So I'll stop there because, you know, it's one of those things like I have this love-hate relationship with AI, right? Because on the one hand, I don't like to be surveilled in terms of my data, my private data at that. But on the second hand, being a person who has been working in the space of technology, there's some curious innovation that potentially can help in areas that I like to talk about, which are groups that have been medically underserved or historically vulnerable, and how we can actually leverage some of the data that is coming into these systems to make better decisions and predictions could be interesting. There's a caveat, I'll get back to that later, but it could be an interesting, I think, plus to the use of AI and helping forward.
Danielle, do you see that same kind of benefit potential, especially for like people who have been underserved or whose conditions or the specifics of their healthcare needs haven't really been well met before?
Absolutely. There are absolutely ways that AI can be focused on helping to address disparities instead of widening the gaps that already exist. I think, you know, hospitals are using these technologies, for instance, to identify people who are at high risk of readmissions because of social factors, and then to provide care management services to those people proactively so that they're not coming back to the hospital the next time they don't have enough food to eat or they don't have a place to sleep at night. So I think there are certainly ways that these technologies can be used to address disparities that exist in society. The only other thing I wanted to add to what Nicole said is that, you know, I think we are seeing a huge increase in these technologies now for a couple of reasons. One is we've had this huge push to have more healthcare data be electronic. Electronic health records have been a huge push over the last decade or two, and that's enabled people to use that data to then create these tools. And then that's been coupled with the increasing computing technologies and power that so that people can use this huge amount of data to understand patterns, or to have tools that understand patterns, and then that can predict what's going to happen for different sets of folks. So I think those are like two big things, two big points of important points that have led to the huge increase in the types of technologies that we're seeing in the healthcare space.
So, you know, we can sort of maybe think of this as kind of a data hungry kind of technology. And so that means that the quality of the data matters, right? So if we are feeding it junk food, then it's going to have, you know, different outcomes. So I think, you know, many of us are sort of aware in a general sense that like the underlying data sets and problems with them then feed into the technology itself. But presumably there are also ways to correct for that. Yet I know that even those may not be completely sort of watertight. So can you maybe, Danielle, help us understand a little bit about how that bias, where that bias concern is at, just in terms of the quality of the data that's feeding into the technology?
Yeah, so I will say there are a ton of different sets of data that are being used to produce these tools. But if we think just about healthcare claims data as an example, in order to know how your AI tool is going to be biased, you have to know how that claims data is biased to begin with. So in our healthcare system, we know that different types of people have better or worse access to healthcare services. If we know that coming in, and we have a strong understanding of how that's reflected in our data, then we can manipulate the data in ways to try to address for that. So if we know that there are certain groups that aren't represented in the data, then we maybe manipulate the data so that the data that we do have on those groups is amplified in ways that the data for other groups isn't. But the most important thing is we have to know how data is biased to begin with. Otherwise, it does become really, really tricky to address those underlying biases if we don't know what they are.
And when you say claims data, you're talking about, like, for instance, so just for people who maybe aren't in the US as well, like claims data is like data we have on what the services that people actually use that are processed through their insurance or through their public assistance insurance programs. Is that what you mean by that?
Exactly. Yeah. Sorry, that is a good point of clarification.
No, that's okay. So that would show. So I think there was an example that you had about that recently, wasn't there, where the claims data suggested. Well, can you just explain a little bit about how claims data might work in real life in terms of creating an algorithm or creating a kind of an AI response?
Sure. So there was this example in the United States where a very large health insurer used claims data to predict how much healthcare services certain individuals will need in the future. And through an analysis done by a separate group of that tool, we learned that the algorithm predicted that white people with the same conditions as other people from other minority groups needed more healthcare services. And the reason that the tool predicted that was because in the claims data, white people were getting more healthcare services because they had different access to healthcare than other racial and ethnic minority groups. So those are the types of things that can happen if we don't very closely look at the biases that exist in the data sets that we're using to create these tools.
Thank you. Thank you. And so that's one kind of injustice, which is that the data set itself is biased or has, data that reflects existing social biases in it. But there's also the other sort of injustice of just like whether or not really everybody will have access, or whether in the case of healthcare, everybody's healthcare providers will be able to use it. So I know that sort of mirrors a more general interest of yours, Nicole, and this like the divide between those who get to benefit from technology and those who don't. So how are you seeing that in this context?
Well, Danielle was being quite kind. I think that the example that she gave was an egregious illustration of how biased healthcare is in general. AI is not necessarily going to create its own systemic biases. It's actually going to play off of the existing biases that we have. So in the example of the medical claims data, relying upon an to make determinations of health facilities using hospitalization information in an area that basically makes low-income, rural, predominantly people of color populations much more marginalized within the healthcare space, you know, that was going to happen. But before I actually talk about, like, you know, how we can deduce bias in other ways, it's very important that we actually think about this concept called data trauma. One, in the case of the hospital claims, we are seeing developers who are not necessarily clinicians or medical practitioners that are developing algorithms for people that they are somewhat removed from, do not have an idea about those lived experiences, have not thought about the sociocultural context in which we are actually designing those models. That's the first thing. You know, whoever was putting that model together that Danielle was talking about clearly has not done a really good history of health care and health disparities in this country. The second thing with data trauma is data can be biased in the healthcare space because we have a disproportionate representation of patients who have been historically distrustful of these systems, but more importantly, are often underrepresented in clinical trials. And so there are cases where women are underrepresented when it comes to drug testing or any type of physical or pharmaceutical testing. There are people of color who do not show up in those databases as well. And so it's one thing I think when we talk about just being biased, that we have to think about bias from these very active cases of behavioral impacts that affect communities and have unintended consequences. But we also have to think about bias as it's embedded into computational models that are essentially relying upon systemic trends that come with these unsettled and unanswered questions that then make determinations around healthcare. And when I think about this, and I've spoken a lot of panels on this, and I think about, for example, COVID, and there was a point when Dr. Fauci got up and said, I did not realize that the comorbidities and the chronic disease of African-American populations was going to worsen COVID symptoms in those populations. To me, that suggests that we need a bigger conversation around more inclusive healthcare models on the practitioner and clinical space side. And we need to interrogate then the models when they are actually deployed to ensure that they are inclusive and represented. That's what I was saying with Dr. Faye Cobb, this whole idea of interrogating the microdata in these data sets could be an interesting concept and not necessarily relying on large swaths of information to make determinations around diseases that have proclivities towards certain demographic groups. And so that's really one of the reasons why I stay up at night when it comes to AI, because I think that these systems can make predictions that can have consequential outputs, not just physically on individuals, but it can unravel the long efforts to make people more trustworthy and trustful of their healthcare systems. When a computer makes a mistake, think about how that sort of is compounded when a doctor makes a mistake among populations that we are really trying to work hard to build that trust.
So some of the systems that you're talking about are, developed by, I guess, startups and other kind of, high kind of fast, quick, high innovating kind of groups, but some are also being developed in hospital settings using, with clinicians involved. So Danielle, do you think that there are models for developing the tools that can help address some of these problems really? And because there's, as you were pointing out, you have to take into account the social context of the data and that you're putting in. So are there ways that that's being managed?
I think so, but the one problem with hospitals developing their own tools is that like a very large hospital system is going to be able to have a lot of data and they're going to be able to do it for themselves, but small rural hospitals aren't. They're not going to have the amount of data required, and they probably aren't going to have a staff person who's just devoted to like developing AI tools. So that's where I think your earlier question comes into play, which is, are we potentially creating more of a divide in the healthcare system in terms of who is able to access and use these tools and who isn't. And I do think that there is a big risk there, because you can't just take a large tool developed or a tool developed by a large healthcare system and apply it to a small rural hospital, because it's going to have a completely different patient population. So the data used to develop and train the tool isn't going to be applicable to that population. So I think that's where there's that's very tricky. And I don't personally know a great solution for how you take a tool developed in one system and then apply it to a different system. The other problem in this space is that rural hospitals or smaller hospitals could potentially purchase AI tools, but a lot of the AI tools that are available for purchase are proprietary. And what that means is that these small hospitals don't have any ability to learn what data was used to develop the tool and how, and then to make judgments about how well it can apply to their own population. So I think the proprietary nature of like private development of AI is a huge problem that, you know, that needs to be addressed in order to further help these small rural hospitals figure out how they can use these technologies.
This reminds me so much of conversations that we've been having for a while about genetics, where tools are developed based on, you know, data sets of collections of genetic data that may not represent the people that the tools are then being applied for, tests and you know, prediction. So there's work to try to correct for some of those problems, including by creating bigger, more diverse, more representative, I guess, data sets in the first place. Is that the kind of initiative that's happening in AI to try to sort of correct the underlying or offer up a richer, more representative data for the tools to be used on? Is that an effort that's underway? And if so, who's leading it, or where is it happening?
You know, I would just say that, first and foremost, Danielle, thank you for sharing that, right? Because I was just in a conversation around that very topic, also bringing in urban community clinics, right? And even the devices or equipment that they have are often incongruent. So thank you for saying that. You know, I think to your point, I mean, people like me who are policymakers, we would love to see ways to co-evolve de-biased systems or anti-racist, anti-discriminatory systems. We're starting something at Brookings, which is an AI equity lab, which will hopefully start a pathway to a conversation on how you develop anti-racist, anti-discriminatory AI. But the challenge is you have to have protection of patients and subjects. You know, I'm always reminded, Josephine, Danielle, of Henrietta Lacks, right, whose family just got compensated for the use of her DNA to actually have major discovery in cancer. She was a Black woman whose DNA actually, you know, allowed us to innovate in ways in terms of cure that we were not able to do that before. But she was exploited, and her, you know, she died a pauper, essentially, because she was never, you know, she was sort of indemnified without any type of responsibility on the part of the people who were doing the testing. I think with any type of regulatory co-evolution in this space, there have to be patient rights and protections. And we have to find ways to do it in safe spaces, particularly in areas where we do need that data. You know, I'm one of those people that I'm really skeptical of paying people to give their data or having people come in, you know, for these purposes of big companies who are more market driven to drive really important areas that require some red lines when it comes to patient safety. Privacy is another area of concern, as well as just long-term unintended consequences. I mean, these are people that we're dealing with. So I think, Josephine, to your point, we haven't done a really great job in the United States on that right now. You know, we have bits and pieces of this, like I think the FDA has been doing a really good job in terms of monitoring and managing how they approve products that come through that are AI enabled. We're seeing something with the Product Safety Agency, which is looking at medical devices. But we're sort of in the United States, you know, and less so in the EU, a bunch of Post-it notes trying to put together the story right here. And these sectors are part of the story, but they somehow remain on the edge. And so I think, to your point, just much more work has to be done to find ways to make these technologies much more inclusive, but to also respect the context and the history in which we're actually doing these types of testing and, things that could result in greater public interest.
Yeah, and the one other thing on the federal side I'll mention is there is this AI Bill of Rights in the United States from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which I think has some really good information in it about things that people should be aware of, but it's not a law. It's just a Bill of Rights. It's just out there for people to take a look at and be familiar with.
When you say just a Bill of Rights, that seems like it would be above, like even more important than a law. So is this like a
non-binding Bill of Rights?
Non-binding, right?
So
That's that kind of Bill of Rights. It's not on a scroll. It's in a document, right? But it's non-enforceable, non-binding, unfortunately.
So is it sort of basically a set of recommendations from a government agency about how developers should behave, or what is it? It's framed as rights of patients and people whose data is used, or what is the
people impacted by AI? And it's from the White House. So okay. it is it's from the top of the government in the United States. And it has basically 5 principles that lay out things that people should be able to expect with respect to how AI is used and applied to them. And then it's actually, I think it's a really nice document. And then you can click into each principle and see examples of why the principle is important, how it's been applied, and stuff like that. So it is actually a very nice document. I don't know how widely it's been used, but I do think it is a great starting point in terms of thinking through principles of the appropriate use of AI and how people should be informed of how it's being used.
Yeah, it's more.
So that's something that we should expect. We should expect people, but it also presumably is there for developers to see how they should be thinking about the people whose data they're using and the people who will presumably one day be impacted by the technologies they're creating. Is that fair?
You hope, but I mean, there's a lot of contradictory conversations going on in Washington, right? So President Biden has recently sort of brokered voluntary commitments which assume, appropriate self-regulatory behavior on the part of companies who are developing AI products or large language models that feed into generative AI. You have on Congress particular sectoral bills that are trying to get at issues of healthcare employment. And then you have what we call guidance, right? Which is things like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which has come out with some guidance on how to use AI in hiring for employers. The challenge is these companies that we're talking about are American-based companies, right? And they're companies where AI can have a direct user impact like we've been talking about, but they also can be embedded on the back end. They can be part of, like I said, the pharmaceutical application. My nurse physician assistant did not say, hey, I'm using AI and I'm trying to figure out your drug interactions. She basically was like, give me a minute. Oh, it looks like these are all the drugs that you should not take, versus trying to check the book or going through, it was reminding me of the doctors who would leave the office for about 10 minutes and then come back and write you a prescription because they were checking out what your drug interactions were. We're not always going to know what those things are, right, Josephine? I mean, we're not going to know the AI that's embedded somewhere in the integration and the design of a product. What we're trying to be concerned with is the other side of the quote unquote black box, which are the outcomes that can lend themselves to differential treatment or disparate impact, which is the case of the medical claim information.
Having, so one of the things that your example shows is that, and might be consoling, I think, is that there's the keeping, especially in healthcare settings, the keeping of a clinician, a trained expert as in the kind of loop of the use of the AI is, is one of the ways in which bias and, any other flaws in the system could be caught, can be mediated. But there are other mechanisms as well, so that are being proposed, not, the Bill of Rights, I guess, being one of them, and cleaning up the data set that feeds into it. But how about this transparency? So I personally don't really know how much help it would be if we were more transparent about the fact that people are using AI as part of the thinking, because there are many things that go into my doctor's head that I don't know that are part of the kind of figuring out of what happens. But some transparency is probably really important. So like how much, when people say we need more transparency around the AI and that will help, how much transparency and where, like, and what's actually realistic? Because companies are also going to want some kind of proprietary control as well. Danielle, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to make a blanket statement about transparency just because these tools are so diverse. You know, like, do I really care if my doctor's office uses an AI tool to help with scheduling? Not really. But do I care if my, you know, my images are being read by an AI tool first? Yeah, probably, you know, I mean, to the extent that my doctor is also looking at it, that's fine. But I mean, if you are basing a decision on an AI tool, I think that's very consequential to an individual's life. It becomes really important that that person know that and at least have access to some information about that tool. Like, how was it developed? You know, what was the data set? And that can be for a variety of reasons. It can be because the person has a right to know that. Can be one, but also if there is harm caused by the tool, that person needs to know that because they might want to take some action based on that, you know, incorrect diagnosis that was made. So I think there is a spectrum that exists, and the spectrum is maybe based on risk to the individual. I think on the other side of that, though, is like the physician really is the person, especially if it's being used at the point of care, that needs to be able to understand how the prediction is being made, what data was used to develop the AI tool. They're the ones that really need to understand what's going on, because they need to be able to then take the recommendation that was made by the tool and understand, you know, whether it's correct for the patient that's under their care. And that's the important point about keeping the provider in the loop. I don't think that providers are always well positioned to be able to do this, though. And that's, I think, a big gap that exists right now, and one where there really does need to be more training at the medical school level. And I just don't know how often that's occurring right now.
Nicole, that sounds a bit like product labeling almost, right? Like, here's, you know that there was GM in your, GM was used in this product, or, that the kind of like the genetically modified foods labeling or other kind of labeling. Is that a live proposal in DC to kind of require that kind of transparency along the sort of like product labeling or lines? Are you seeing anything in that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of proposals, labeling being one of them, that's not widely, lauded, only because how do you label AI, right? These are organic, iterative systems, and it's hard to say this is how we label it, or like what the FDA does, level 1, level 2, level 3. In terms of medical device complexity, then they're able to give some type of sign off on them. I think the push really needs to be around standards, right? So what are the standards that go into creating equitable, trustworthy, responsible AI? What does that look like? And I think for the medical field, I think it is really important too, because this is a very journal-based profession, to use AI in ways that we can actually contribute. And I love the way Danielle talked about it, where transparency looks like documentation, right? It looks like evidence. It looks like collaboration. It looks like the type of coordination of care that we do when we're looking at a variety of diseases or diagnoses, where one doctor may have to talk to, a blood doctor may have to talk to an endocrinologist, may have to talk to someone else, sort of replicating that environment online. What that looks like is still undetermined, right? Because I love the point, we're going to have young doctors who are going to grow up with this stuff, right? And they're going to go into the doctor's office and they're going to rely upon the AI to basically give you a likelihood or predictability that you have this, or you have this propensity towards this disease. An older doctor, one who's been around for a while, not necessarily in age, but who's a little more seasoned, may be more skeptical of the AI, and they may be looking at the AI as one source of evidence or investigation, but they may rely upon, their own tactile, skill set and in memory to figure out diagnosis. I think for the medical profession, there's going to have to be a conversation. And the fact that it has to be done in medical school is one way to do it, or at hospitals, for example, that we talked about, where they're constantly doing retraining on these tools and they're constantly exposing people to these tools. Standards is really the way to go. I think it's easier to put labels on devices, your heart devices, your respiratory devices. It's so much harder to put a label on AI. I've actually, in my own research, proposed more of like a reputational listing, something that at least gives confidence that this tool is representative of a diverse data set of people. It has some sign off on secondary, tertiary context. It's not just been trained in a laboratory. It was also vouched for by practitioners who in some way are able to contribute to the documentation of that product, of that AI model. Something like that to me seems to be more organic versus, what we're hearing from companies, well, we're going to fix this problem ourselves. That we're thinking through this, and the companies that want a label are essentially those, right? Like, give us a label and we'll tell you how we're managing the Substack. But as Danielle said, we're talking about people's lives. We're not necessarily talking about just a model. We're talking about a model that interacts with people.
Wouldn't these be devices that the FDA would need to approve the way they approve other kinds of medical devices? And if so, then, like you were saying, there would be standards that you have to meet. How do you develop? You have to sort of prove that evidence, the back end of the product needs to be checked. Is that what's going to be? Is that what's already happening at the FDA? Or
well, the FDA has been very progressive actually in putting out an AI standard. I think much of what we're seeing on the AI enabled devices is an easier way to fit those modules into their standards framework. But on the other areas, the FDA has been kind of careful, right, on AI, because not all particular medical areas are fully developed in this space. Like, they've got great examples, if you ever go to the FDA reports on radiology use of this, ophthalmology, because those data sets tend to be more filled out versus, endocrinology is still a growing field of being able to leverage AI products and tools. I think what we're seeing, actually, just to make it clear for the people listening, we're seeing more of a discussion on risk, right? Risk and harms. And I think that conversation is probably going to lend itself to, and this is my prediction, probably less of a label and more of a question of who has oversight and jurisdiction, right? And how do you manage risk generally in the United States, and how do you manage it by sectors? And I think we're going to see more of this risk management framework coming out on these models that in some way they're not transparent, because they're models that start, I always give the example, I think of algorithms as a snake at the bottom of the ocean. When you drop the snake in, after they wad through all the sand and the coral and all the other debris at the bottom, they look very different before they come up to the top. That's all of the movement that's happening on these models before they actually spit out a determination. And that's an area, again, which is much harder for us to actually regulate in areas like healthcare, criminal justice, employment, because the outcomes are what we care about, not necessarily how this model is being developed. We do care about that. Let me take that back. But it's the outcomes that most of us who are not data scientists, let me put it that way, are trying to figure out how we got here.
The only other thing I wanted to add to that is just the FDA only has oversight of software as a medical device, right. And a lot of AI being used in the healthcare space does not fit the definition of a medical device. So okay. a lot of it is not regulated at all. Like if my doctor uses GPT to write up some notes based on my visit, that is not regulated. If it's things like use in radiology, use for guiding surgeries, like those are devices and those are regulated by the FDA. So there are like more than 500 devices that have gone, AI-enabled devices that have gone through the FDA. And I think they have a great, they really are trying to be innovative, but there's so much of what's being used that's not regulated at all.
And it won't be, or do we think that might change? Will it just be regulated in the way that like you can sue, or like you as consumer, the kind of consumer protections that exist, but are different from like the level that we expect from FDA approved products?
I think there's a lot of calls, even from the tech side, for more regulation in this space, but there isn't right now. And I don't think we've seen, at least I'm not aware of a huge, a big development in this area that's likely to come down the pike soon. So again, a lot of AI in general is just completely unregulated.
Right. I was going to say, after listening to the FDA on Saturday at a panel, I think to Danielle's point, they are trying to lock down their what's under their jurisdiction, which is the medical device enabled AI. But they are also trying to start conversations on other aspects of risk they should be managing. But again, it's like those Post-it notes, right? There's not one centralized jurisdictional authority that can combine the technical cadence with the public interest. And that's where we get stuck, again, compared to the EU, that tends to be much more prescriptive with regards to what they expect from these technologies.
Okay. I wonder if we should maybe actually remind everyone that we are taking questions in the Q&A, and we could actually look at some of those questions now. So Brianna's going to help with this. I think she's been monitoring the Q&A and can just maybe let us know one or two questions now that we could already take on from our audience.
Sounds good. A common thread has been about doctor-patient relationships. So they're a thread of concern for the implications of AI. What are your thoughts on preserving or improving doctor-patient relationships / interactions while using AI to improve healthcare?
Right, thank you. Who wants to take this? Because I think anyone could. Yeah, Nicole.
I mean, well, look, I think to some of the examples that we gave, having AI does bring, much like telemedicine and telehealth, these automated systems brings healthcare closer to patients, particularly those that are medically underserved. The challenges, and this is the focus of my book, Shameless Plug, is that we have populations, disproportionate numbers of people who do not have digital access. So the assumption that AI is going to be something that people can use, when they leave the doctor's office, or they can feed their, insulin numbers, or, a diabetic can feed their numbers to the doctor using AI to sort of get an immediate response. That's unrealistic. In my book, I met this woman in a parking lot of a library. She literally had to check her electronic health records at a local library, of which she found out she had stage 4 cancer in a local library. And I document these travels that I had in my book. So I think we have to also be sensitive to the fact that it may help certain patients based on their assets, wealth, claims, but it may also serve to widen the digital disparity gaps if AI turns out to be a tool that can help us more granularly in addressing some more particular and specific.
So in that example that you just gave of somebody, it's also it would also seem like that person doesn't even have a clinician. So I think one of the concerns would be that people already maybe feel like they don't get enough access to their clinician, or it's really quick, really rushed. And then AI's tools can enable those processes to go even more quickly. And so even if a clinician is sort of nominally involved, maybe it's not for long, it's not very, and that I know a lot of people do feel like something is lost in the connection between clinician and patient, and the kind of healing that happens in that relationship. That's right. And I guess ideally, one selling point would be like, wow, AI tools can just, give the clinician more time, so they don't have to spend as much time doing one thing, they can spend more time with the patient. But of course, most of us are also worried that the complete opposite would be the case, and that some people would get lots of extra time with their clinician, but a lot of people would get less time and maybe no time. Right. And that's the kind of what might be further lost in the kind of automation or kind of digitization and kind of AIification of the healthcare encounter.
Well, but there are some positives. I was just talking to somebody generative AI, for example, if it was more universally available, could help patients who were coming in to see their doctor to have questions to ask. You all remember we used to try to do that with patients. I've been in telehealth and telemedicine research for a long time when it came to Google search, right? Ask these questions, and these are things you might want to say when you get to the doctor, because we know certain patients don't ask questions. But the challenge again is, you know, there's liability obviously for the clinician if people think that the generative AI, the AI is more correct than their physician. My mother is one of those people. She reads everything online before she goes into a specialty doctor, and then she argues that doctor down. But then if you don't have the access to the technology and your visits to the clinician are scanty, what is technology going to do? And so we just have to be careful, that along with the data sets being potentially biased, that we don't replicate again many of the systemic inequalities that we already see in our healthcare system.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think there are, you know, we know that clinicians can't keep up with the medical literature. It's impossible. So to the extent that an AI tool can help take that literature, combine it with data that exists about patients within the same healthcare system, and provide information that the clinician can use at the point of care, at the point of care when talking to the patient, to come to a more informed decision together about what to do. I think like that is the ideal, you know, that is a great outcome. If in AI, but on the other hand, if a clinician is just taking the prediction and saying, okay, this is what we should do without any conversation, that's a bad outcome. We don't want the clinician just to solely rely on these tools and not use the training and the interpersonal skills that they've developed through medical school. So I think there are risks and benefits, and it all goes into training on how we are using these AI tools. If trained and used appropriately, I think that they can potentially strengthen the relationship in many ways, but there is of course a danger.
Brianna, do you have another one for us?
Yes. This one says, please address the impact of AI on healthcare providers and workers regarding its impact on professional identity, job security, and the current high levels of burnout and moral distress.
Oh, yes. So it seems like we've already kind of talked about that it does the need to retain clinicians. So it's not like we're just going to get rid of them and we can just use the AI can just be the doctor. But and Danielle, you were offering an example where where AI could actually help alleviate some of the burden on clinicians by kind of summarizing, I guess, what's been happening in the literature and helping apply that to patients. But do you see other ways that it could be kind of helpful for clinicians? Not necessarily, you know, directly for patients, but help the clinicians themselves to have more manageable workloads, or, you know, kind of make their jobs better.
Yeah, I think there's some of the clinical notes data entry stuff. I mean, using natural language processing and other generative AI tools, it can be useful for helping the clinicians get through those notes. And again, if used appropriately, and the notes, you know, assuming the AI tool is spitting out notes that are accurate, that can be another way to help reduce clinician burden. I mean, on the administrative side, which generally isn't taken care of by clinicians, but by office staff, you know, I think there are AI tools that can help with scheduling. There are AI tools that can help review long documents and pull out salient information about like why something would be denied or approved. So there are these AI tools that can be integrated into a practice or a clinician's office to help reduce some of the administrative burdens that they face.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, in direct response to that question, there will be job loss, right? Particularly in roles that are highly repetitive, can be automated, clerical, health notes processing, medical document processing. We're going to see all of that. And the extent to which we'll see that in hospitals, you know, is still questionable, right? In terms of how it would affect, you know, nurses and others who are basically maintaining the basic level of need as a patient is in their care. So, you know, this is one of those questions across professions we're really thinking about, right? Because most of the people that are in those positions tend to be women, or they tend to be people of color, or they tend to be people with disabilities, or somebody who came in to do something that was an easy grasp for them, or because of systemic inequality, they were not able to get up the food chain for whatever reason, and they have to start there. So I know at Brookings, we're sort of thinking about how do you look at that landscape of automation? And to Danielle's point, are there areas where it's not necessarily of outsizing people out of this industry, but training them up or training them across so that they can just do their job differently?
Okay, great. Thank you. Brianna?
Yes. This one is how do you prevent human bias being introduced in big data models and AI to prevent undesired outcomes? And I'd like to add to the original question, there has been a thread about racial inequality concern in big data.
You know, I think you have to start with the fact that these models are trained on the values, assumptions, and norms that we all carry in life. And who we are when we're developing these models has a great impact on whether or not they represent the lived experiences and cultural efficacies of communities that are being the subjects of these technologies. And I think this is a question across the board. I mean, you look at technologies that are not healthcare, like facial recognition technologies, that still cannot identify people with darker skin complexions, or where image quality or lighting matters, but yet they're still being used on determinations for policing, customs, and border control. It's the same thing that we're going to see across the board. How you fix that is that you have to make more representation at the table. People who are training these models, unfortunately, should not just be heterogeneous white men who are data scientists, right? They need to be medical practitioners, community health practitioners, patient advocates, social scientists, you know, people who make determinations around the well-being of communities should sit at that table. And the other thing, and we didn't talk about it, we just really talked about in terms of demographics, people who understand that externalities include access to food, access to housing, access to transportation. You know, those things also matter because they have certain propensities to determine some of the environmental considerations for people's livelihood and well-being. So there's no easy answer. And it is one, like I said, Brookings, we're developing this AI equity lab. One of the things that we're really trying to do is to convene small groups of people who come from different parts of the ecosystem so that we can have those conversations. But, you know, unfortunately, the train has left the station. There are very big companies that are driving this for market versus people. And it becomes a question of how much does this industry care about creating their own Bill of Rights, their own agency over the technologies they procure and they use on patients.
Well, so that's the thing, right? Everything that we've been saying is harder. It takes more time, it takes more expertise, it takes more insight, it takes a closer look at the data, you know, correcting for all kinds of challenges in the data. And all of that is more expensive to do than the kind of quick and maybe, you know, quick and dirty kind of version of the technology. And so it sounds like we will have a plethora of different tools available, some of which were developed carefully with really a lot of insight, etc., and some of which were not. And then that's the kind of competing marketplace. And if there aren't standards, or if there aren't, if you don't need to get something approved and show how you developed it and what that you corrected for all of these things, then it's kind of well, I guess you'd hope that eventually the market will pick the better ones, but like, is it that much of a kind of free-for-all, or are we actually able to? I know that you could perhaps, you know, suing after the fact always seems like a really bad way of fixing problems, but like, how else is it? Just buyer beware.
Well, it's also, I don't think it's very easy to sue because there's diffuse responsibility. I mean, who are you suing? Are you suing the person that used the tool? Are you suing the person that developed the tool? So that's not that's not even straightforward. I unfortunately, in some spaces, I do think it's a free-for-all. And it is a situation where you need to be aware of what you're using, or how you could be impacted. Like with ChatGPT, people need to be aware that anything that they put into that can be used by the model for future training. I mean, nothing that you put in there is private. And there are other things that you need to be aware of, like the model was only developed based on internet data up through 2021, right? So anything that happened after 2021 is not reflected in the answers you're getting from ChatGPT, and that can have a big impact, especially like depending on, you know, what you're trying to get an answer to. So, and there are other examples of that as well. I mean, you know, if you're putting your medical information out there onto a website that has a tool that you think could be useful, you need to be very, very careful with that, because there aren't necessarily privacy regulations. You're not protected by HIPAA if you're putting your own information out there in the public domain. So I think there is a need for more regulation or standards or something, but that's not where we are right now.
Because it's too much for consumers or patients to have to be thinking about all of that, and it may even be too much for their care providers to be sort of like very kind of discerning.
But this is why I think the healthcare space has something of sort of an edge on this, right? If we were to take all this stuff that we talked about, the doom and the gloom, and just think about the positives, right? I mean, for a profession that has always grappled with liability, that comes into this space with a particular oath around the duty of care when it comes to health and well-being, I'm optimistic that industries like healthcare, industries like, you know, education, where there is some type of implicit and explicit understanding of that relationship with consumers or, you know, students or patients, will begin to think about how they leverage these principles among their national and international associations, and how they begin to think about AI in healthcare and come up with the same type of guidance and standards in the absence of regulatory guardrails. What I mean by that, there is no one in DC trying to change HIPAA right now. No one, right? There's a few people who every once in a while will mention, well, maybe we need to go back and revisit HIPAA and update it. But that's not happening at this moment, because I think it took a lot of effort to come up with HIPAA. And I'm just hopeful that the healthcare industry will really sit down and think about this. Another case in point, you know, I'm hearing a lot more healthcare insurance agencies thinking about this, because as a quilted ecosystem, how you treat AI is the same way that you treat the use of telehealth and telemedicine and other digital health tools. And they're going to have implications on the extent to which doctors are reimbursed, and they're going to have implications on liability, and they're going to have implications on the trust and reputational risk that comes with how we administer healthcare. So, you know, people like me are looking to these industries to sort of help us think through these big issues, because it's going to take a long time before I think Washington comes to agreement on some values around this outside of, you know, one part of the aisle really appreciating the White House Bill of Rights.
Okay, so now I'm really hoping or thinking that, yeah, like you said, it's a high stakes environment. There are already a lot of protections or kind of a protective mindset in place. And so professional bodies inside of healthcare, you know, have a role to play in addition to med schools and insurers. So Brianna, we probably have some other questions I want to make sure we get to, because we haven't got much more time.
Yeah, we probably have time for one more question.
Okay, great, thank you.
This is, where do you think the interaction between social science and AI/tech is most needed?
Ooh, anyone?
Well, I mean, you know, look, I'm a sociologist by training, so I think showing up to conversations really matters. But I'm also a researcher, right, at heart, much like medical doctors. We have peer-reviewed journals that can be done, you know, articles that can be done collaboratively to provide evidence-based information. We have conferences where we can talk about these issues. I think I used to say that every computer scientist should have a sociologist as a friend and take a social science course during the time that they were in computer science. I'm now believing that every sociologist should take a data science class. You know, I think as this evolves, we're just going to have to figure out where we start this process. And Danielle said it, at the medical school and college and pre-med, and then beyond in terms of your certification as you use these tools further.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think also, you know, just understanding our society and how it impacts the data that we have, because you can't you should not create an AI tool without understanding the data that you're using, and how it's impacted by the patterns that exist in our society.
Thank you so much. So in addition to sort of using social science to study the impacts of it and test it, we can also use social scientists' knowledge of things like how data are collected and the biases that can go into that to kind of understand how to clean up the data sets or create ones that are more equitable, more reliable, perhaps, than the ones that we're using already. Is that fair?
Yeah, and we as social scientists, I mean, some of the best papers I've written have been with people who are in the space of their science, right? And so being able to do health policy with people who are health practitioners, it just makes a lot more sense, which is the same discussion and campaign that we're putting out for an AI. Bring us to the table, pull up a chair, hear what we have to say to make these systems much more responsive and responsible in their application.
Well, I wish we could keep going, but we can't. So we're at the time. I want to remind everybody that a recording of this will be available soon on the Hastings Centre's website, I think later today. But and then my only task remaining really is to thank Nicol and Danielle for having this conversation with me and with us and with the Hastings Centre and with our audience. And thank you to all of you who joined and listened, and to Brianna for all of your coordination. So thanks very, very much. Yeah, and Brianna, back to you. Thank God.
Thank you. This recording should be out soon, and let us know if you have any questions. But everyone, thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.